Ladies and gentlemen, today we gather to explore a profound truth that can transform our lives, the power of surrendering our worries to God. In a world filled with uncertainty, anxiety often becomes a familiar companion. It creeps into our hearts and minds, clouding our judgment and stealing our peace. However, there is a divine antidote to this worry, a deep, trusting relationship with God. The first keynote, which explores the idea that God may allow hurt in our lives for a greater purpose, is a foundational truth in understanding God's sovereignty and the nature of suffering. It challenges a common misconception that a loving and all-powerful God would prevent pain and difficulty from entering our lives. However, this understanding requires a deeper reflection on God's nature and His ultimate purposes for His children. It is important to recognize that while God is not the author of evil, He is fully aware of the suffering we experience, and He has the power to use even the most painful circumstances to accomplish something good in our lives. When we think about God's sovereignty, we are reminded that nothing happens by accident. God's reign over creation includes not just the joyful and peaceful moments, but also the trials and tribulations that we encounter. The pain we go through, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, is never beyond His reach. Even if others cause our hurt or we bring it upon ourselves through our mistakes, God is not distant. He is present, and He has the capacity to redeem every situation. Take, for instance, the story of Job in the Bible. Job was a man who experienced immense suffering. He lost his wealth, his health, and his family. His life was in complete turmoil. Yet even as Job questioned God about the reason for his pain, the underlying message of his story was that God allowed this suffering to test and refine his faith. Job was not being punished. Rather, God was using his circumstances to purify his character and bring him to a deeper understanding of God's greatness and sovereignty. Ultimately, through his trials, Job's faith grew stronger, and God was glorified. The Bible tells us that God works all things together for the good of those who love Him, Romans 8:28. This doesn't mean that all things are good in and of themselves. Pain is real, loss is tragic, and hurt is hurtful. But it does mean that God can take these difficult and painful experiences and weave them into a greater story of redemption. There is purpose in what we endure, even if we cannot immediately see it. God has a way of taking brokenness and using it to create something whole. In many cases, it is only through hardship that we are able to grow spiritually. Consider the way that pressure refines gold. Gold must go through intense heat to remove impurities and become pure. Similarly, trials and difficulties in our lives serve as a refining fire for our faith. It is often during our most challenging moments that we are forced to rely on God more deeply. These times of suffering can strip away our self-sufficiency and cause us to turn to God in ways we never would if everything were going smoothly. The Apostle Paul writes in Corinthians 12:9 and 10, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." This passage underscores the idea that God often uses suffering as a means of showing His strength in our weakness. When we are hurt, when we feel weak, we are given the opportunity to experience God's strength in ways we would not otherwise know. His presence becomes more tangible in our moments of weakness, teaching us to rely on Him and trust in His sufficiency. Moreover, God's ability to use our hurt for a greater purpose also ties into His desire to shape us into the image of Christ. Jesus Himself experienced the ultimate hurt, betrayal, rejection, physical torment, and death. His suffering was not in vain. It had eternal significance for all of humanity. As followers of Christ, we are called to take up our own crosses, to embrace the pain and difficulties that come with living in a fallen world, and to trust that God will use these experiences to make us more like Jesus. Our sufferings are an opportunity for us to reflect His love, His patience, His grace, and His endurance. In light of this, we can begin to view our own hurt not as a random or senseless event, but as a means through which God is working in our lives. While it may seem difficult to understand or accept in the midst of pain, we can find comfort in knowing that God has a purpose for everything, and nothing in our lives is wasted. As we grow in our relationship with Him, we can trust that He is at work behind the scenes, orchestrating our circumstances for our good and His glory. The trials we face may be challenging, but they are never without purpose. The second keynote delves into the concept of spiritual growth through suffering, emphasizing that our response to hurt plays a vital role in our development as followers of Christ. Pain and adversity are not just inevitable parts of life. They are instrumental in shaping our spiritual character. Through difficult experiences, God invites us to grow, to trust more deeply, and to become more like Him. Our reactions to the hurts we endure reflect the depth of our faith and our willingness to allow God to refine us through the process of suffering. When we encounter pain or betrayal, our natural instinct might be to recoil, to shut down, or even to lash out in anger or resentment. These are typical human responses to hurt, and they often feel justified. Yet the Bible offers us a different perspective. In Romans 5:03, verse 4, Paul writes, "We also rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope." This passage reveals the transformative nature of suffering. It is not just something to endure passively. It is a process that works within us to cultivate perseverance, strengthen our character, and ultimately lead us to a deeper sense of hope. The idea that suffering can produce perseverance is foundational to understanding spiritual growth. Perseverance, or the ability to endure difficulties with patience and faith, is not something we are born with. It is something that is developed over time, often through hardship. Think of it like a muscle. Just as our muscles need resistance to grow stronger, our spiritual endurance needs challenges to be refined. When we are hurt or face trials, we have an opportunity to press forward in faith, trusting that God is working through the situation to strengthen our trust in Him. As we persevere, we also experience a transformation in our character. Character in this context refers to the moral and spiritual qualities that define us as people. In the face of hurt, we have a choice. Will we allow bitterness to take root, or will we choose forgiveness and grace? Will we become angry and self-absorbed, or will we allow God to develop humility and compassion in us? The choices we make in the midst of pain shape our character in profound ways. Each decision to respond with love, patience, and understanding, rather than with retaliation or bitterness, refines us into the image of Christ. This refining process is essential for spiritual maturity. James 1:02 encourages believers to consider it pure joy whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Notice the word mature in this verse. Spiritual maturity is the goal of every trial we face. God's desire is not just that we survive our pain, but that we grow through it, becoming more steadfast in our faith, more loving in our relationships, and more faithful in our obedience to Him. In many ways, our response to suffering determines how far we will go in our spiritual journey. If we choose to face challenges with a heart that is open to God's refining work, we find that we are not only able to endure, but also to flourish. This flourishing, however, is not the kind of flourishing the world often promises. It is not about external success or comfort, but about an internal transformation that leads to a deeper and more intimate relationship with God. The Apostle Paul writes in Corinthians 4:17, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." What a profound thought. Our suffering, when seen through the lens of eternity, is not in vain, but is actually achieving something greater in us, something that will endure forever. Through every hurt and every challenge, God is shaping us. and his work in our lives is far more significant than our temporary discomfort. When we respond to hurt with trust in God's sovereignty and with a willingness to grow, we open ourselves to the deeper lessons he wants to teach us. We learn more about his faithfulness, his goodness, and his power to redeem even the most painful situations. Furthermore, our spiritual growth through suffering not only benefits us individually, but also has a ripple effect on others. When we endure pain with grace and perseverance, we become living testimonies of God's power. Others can witness our resilience, our ability to forgive, and our unwavering faith, which can draw them closer to God. In Corinthians 1:04, Paul speaks of God's comfort in our afflictions, saying, he comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. In this way, our suffering becomes a means of ministering to others, as we share the comfort and strength that we have received from God. Ultimately, spiritual growth through suffering is about trusting that God's purpose is greater than our pain. It requires us to believe that God is not distant or indifferent to our suffering, but that he is present and at work, shaping us into the image of Christ. This process of spiritual formation, though challenging, is what allows us to become the people God has called us to be. As we respond to hurt with faith, grace, and perseverance, we are not just surviving the difficulties of life, we are growing through them, becoming more like Jesus and reflecting his love and character to the world around us. In conclusion, it is essential to understand that God's plan for our lives is not about avoiding pain or hardship, but about using those very experiences to shape us into the people he has created us to be. Though it may be difficult to accept, God sometimes allows others to hurt us as part of a greater purpose. The pain we endure is not meaningless. Rather, it is an opportunity for God to refine us, to grow our faith, and to deepen our character. Just as gold is purified through fire, our faith is strengthened through trials. Our response to hurt is just as significant as the hurt itself. When we choose to respond with grace, forgiveness, and trust in God, we open ourselves to spiritual growth. The suffering we experience can produce perseverance, build character, and ultimately lead to a deeper hope in God's promises. God uses these moments to draw us closer to him, teaching us to rely more on his strength than our own. So when you face pain or betrayal, remember that God is not absent. He is at work, even in your darkest moments. Trust that he is using every hurt, every challenge, and every difficulty for your good and his glory. And while it may not be easy, know that you are not alone. God is with you in the pain, and he will guide you through it. As you navigate through life's trials, lean into his grace, embrace the lessons he's teaching you, and allow him to transform you into the person he has destined you to be.